In the summer of 1985, a Seattle detective walked out of his office and told his partner he'd be back in a few hours. He never came back. Later, his car was discovered near the docks, the keys still in the ignition, the driver's door wide open like he just stepped out for a moment. But the detective was gone. No footprints, no signs of a struggle. It was like he had simply vanished into the rain. For the next 10 years, his family begged for answers. His fellow officers searched everywhere from the city waterfront to the remote forests and mountain roads, but there was nothing. No body, no weapon, no trace. Then, in 1995, a crushed police radio was found buried at a construction site just outside the city. At first, it looked like random debris, but investigators quickly realized it wasn't an accident. That radio was the missing detective's, and it had been destroyed on purpose. What that radio revealed would tear open a case filled with betrayal, corruption, and secrets, buried deep inside the very department he once served. And the truth was darker than anyone imagined. Before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from. In the mid-1980s, Seattle was a city caught between growth and crime. Drugs were spreading, gangs were tightening their grip, and the police force was under constant pressure. In the middle of all this was one man everyone seemed to trust, Detective Mark Harlan. Mark wasn't just another name on the roster. He was the kind of detective people pointed to and said, "That's who you want on your case." Fellow officers described him as tireless. He stayed late, followed every lead, and refused to cut corners. When new recruits arrived, he was the one they looked up to. But what made Mark different wasn't just the badge. It was who he was at home. He had a wife who adored him and two young children who thought he hung the moon. Neighbors said he was the kind of father who showed up at school events even after working long shifts. He never let the darkness of the job change how he treated his family. Inside the department, he had built a reputation for tackling hard cases. If something was dangerous, if it involved risk, chances were good Mark would be the first one to volunteer. It wasn't recklessness. It was a sense of duty. He believed that if he didn't step up, someone else's family might suffer. This mix of toughness and heart made him stand out. Criminals on the street knew his name and some feared it. But the people who lived in Seattle, the shopkeepers, the dock workers, the families, they saw him as a protector. By 1985, Mark had been on the force long enough to see how crime could ruin lives. He carried those stories with him, and it gave him fuel to keep pushing. His wife later said he seemed to carry the weight of the entire city on his shoulders. But at the same time, he laughed with his kids at the dinner table. For the public, Mark was a trusted detective. For his family, he was the heart of the home. No one imagined that one summer day, both of those worlds would suddenly collapse and leave behind one of the darkest mysteries Seattle had ever seen. Mark's reputation didn't just come from working long hours. It came from the kinds of cases he chose to take. Seattle in the 1980s wasn't just about small crimes. The city was becoming a hub for drugs moving in from overseas. Smugglers used the docks to push shipments inland, and violent gangs fought for control. Mark didn't shy away from this. In fact, he leaned into it. He became known for showing up at the docks in the middle of the night, tracking suspicious cargo, and chasing down leads that others thought were too dangerous. He worked with federal agents on drug busts, and in more than one case, his actions stopped hundreds of pounds of narcotics from hitting the streets. But cases like these created enemies. The kind of people Mark was going after weren't just street dealers. They were tied to organized crime, groups with deep pockets and long memories. Every time Mark made a major bust, it wasn't just a win for the police. It was a loss for someone powerful, and those people rarely forgot who had hurt their business. Other detectives later admitted they sometimes worried about him. Mark would put himself out in the open, standing face to face with men who had no problem pulling a trigger. To him, it was the job. To others, it looked like he was painting a target on his own back. By the summer of 1985, Mark had been working one case in particular that raised eyebrows inside the department. It involved a network of smugglers using the docks to move drugs, weapons, and cash. Whispers floated around that organized crime had a hand in it, and that the network was more powerful than most people realized. Mark was right in the middle of it. Some officers believed he was getting close to shutting the whole thing down, but others thought he was digging too deep, making enemies who would want to shut him down permanently. This was the world Mark operated in: late-night stakeouts, dangerous informants, and criminals with everything to lose. And as much as he believed he could handle it, the truth was simple: the deeper he went, the greater the danger became. And that danger was about to catch up with him. It was March 1985, a cold and gray Seattle morning. The detective woke up early, just like always. His wife remembered how he sat at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee, reading the newspaper. He didn't talk much that morning, but he looked calm. His kids got ready for school, and before leaving, he kissed them on the head. To them, it felt like just another day. When he left his house, he carried his badge, his gun, and his standard-issue police radio. Neighbors saw him lock his door and walk to his car. Nothing looked unusual. At the precinct, he greeted officers on duty with a nod. Some remembered he was dressed sharp: pressed shirt, polished shoes, jacket neat. He looked ready for something important. Inside the station, he spoke briefly to a few colleagues. He asked about shift reports, checked on a couple of cases, and then made a call from his desk. No one knew who he called, but officers remembered he seemed focused, not nervous, not shaken, just serious, like a man carrying weight. Around 9:30 a.m., he signed out of the precinct. He left behind some paperwork on his desk, unfinished, as if he planned to come back later. He told one officer, "I've got something to check out." That was the last clear thing anyone heard him say. He walked out into the gray morning, car keys in his hand. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding. It looked like business as usual. Yet this ordinary morning would become the last time his colleagues and family ever saw him alive. When he left the precinct, the weather had shifted. Rain was falling steady, the streets slick and shining under the weak daylight. A surveillance camera across the street caught him walking toward his car. He looked calm, his coat collar pulled up against the rain. Witnesses later said they saw him drive toward the waterfront near the docks. That area was known for trouble: drug deals, organized crime, and police investigations that often went nowhere. If he was headed there, it wasn't by accident. He had a reason. At 10:15 a.m., a store clerk near the pier spotted him. The detective stood outside, talking on his radio. Then he walked off toward the darker end of the docks. Another witness, a fisherman, remembered seeing him near the warehouses. He wasn't running. He wasn't being chased. He walked with purpose, like he was meeting someone. And then nothing. After 10:30 a.m., the detective vanished. No one saw him leave the docks. His car was later found parked a few blocks away. The driver's seat was dry, which meant he hadn't been gone long before the rain started soaking the lot. But the detective himself was nowhere. The precinct expected him back by lunch. When he didn't show, calls went out. His wife tried his radio. No answer. By evening, a missing persons report was filed. The rain that morning washed away more than footprints. It erased the last visible trail of a detective who had been walking straight into danger and into silence. The first break in the case came just hours after the detective vanished. Officers searching near the docks spotted his car parked along a quiet stretch of the waterfront. It was a dark sedan, the same one he always drove. At first glance, nothing looked wrong, but when they got closer, they saw details that made their stomachs twist. The driver's side door was cracked open. Rain had poured inside, soaking the seat. The keys were still in the ignition, as if he had planned to step out for only a moment. His badge and sidearm were gone, but his leather notebook sat on the passenger seat, pages curling from the damp air. There were no broken windows, no dents, no blood, no signs of a fight. It looked almost too neat, like someone had parked it there on purpose. Officers checked the area, shining flashlights under the car and into nearby puddles. Nothing. A tow truck pulled the sedan back to the precinct garage for inspection. Fingerprints were lifted, but they only showed the detective's own. The engine was still slightly warm, meaning it hadn't been sitting long before it was found. The car was a silent witness. It told them he had been there, but it also left one chilling fact. He had walked away from it into the rain and had never returned. By late afternoon, word had spread through the precinct. One of their best detectives had disappeared. At first, some officers thought he might be working undercover off the grid. But when his wife called in tears saying he hadn't come home, the truth began to sink in. Something was very wrong. The captain ordered an immediate search. Patrol cars circled the docks, their lights flashing through the storm. Officers swept warehouses, alleys, and parking lots. They knocked on doors, asking anyone if they had seen or heard the detective. Most people shook their heads. A few remembered seeing him that morning, but nothing after. Inside the station, tension grew thick. Officers whispered about enemies he had made, about cases that had gotten too close to powerful people. Others asked if maybe he had staged his own disappearance. But deep down, almost everyone felt the same thing: fear. This wasn't just any missing person. This was one of their own, a man who always backed them up, who never backed down. If he could vanish without a trace, it meant no one was safe. By midnight, the precinct was running on adrenaline and dread. Files piled up, phones rang nonstop, but no answers came. The city had lost a detective, and the department had lost its sense of control. 2 days after the disappearance, the story was everywhere. Newspapers ran his photo on the front page. Local TV stations interrupted programs with updates. But the most haunting image came from a live press conference. His wife sat at a long table, cameras pointed straight at her. Her eyes were red, her voice shaking. She clutched a photo of her husband in uniform. Beside her sat their 2 children, a boy and a girl, both too young to fully understand why their father wasn't home. Through tears, she begged, "Please, if anyone knows where he is, if anyone has him, bring him back. We just want him home." Her words were raw, simple, and cut through the noise of rumors. The room fell silent as reporters lowered their pens. The little boy spoke too, softly into the microphone. "Daddy, please come back." That clip replayed again and again on the evening news, breaking hearts across Seattle. The public felt the weight of the family's pain. Strangers lit candles outside the precinct. Some sent food to the family's home. For a moment, the whole city seemed united in hope that the detective would walk through the door. But behind the scenes, officers were shaken even more. They weren't just failing a colleague. They were failing a father, a husband, and children who needed answers. Despite the press, despite the searches, nothing surfaced. Officers dragged the docks, dove into the water, scoured warehouses. Every lead turned to dust. No body, no radio, no footprints. The trail ended at the empty car. Whispers began to grow, both in the department and on the streets. Had the detective run away, leaving everything behind? Or had he been taken by someone who knew exactly how to erase a man from existence? For now, all anyone had was silence. The case, once urgent, was already beginning to stall. The disappearance of a detective was not a normal case. Within days, the story exploded across Seattle. Every newsstand carried his face. "Detective missing," screamed bold headlines. Radio hosts argued about what might have happened. TV reporters stood outside the precinct, pointing at the empty parking space where his car had once been. The pressure on the police was immediate. Citizens flooded the department with calls, demanding answers. How can a cop vanish like that? If they can't protect their own, how can they protect us? Fear spread like wildfire. The chief of police stood before cameras, promising a full investigation. Behind him, officers shifted uneasily, knowing they had no real leads. Every move they made was being watched. Every hour that passed without progress looked like failure. City leaders joined the noise. Council members demanded daily briefings. The mayor's office called for updates every morning. Families across Seattle locked their doors at night, thinking if a detective could disappear, anyone could. Meanwhile, reporters swarmed his family. They camped outside the house, snapping photos of his children on their way to school. His wife avoided interviews, but even silence was turned into headlines. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was a crisis shaking the entire city. Detectives knew the search had to start at the last place he was seen, the docks. They went back with notebooks, flashlights, and endless questions. The waterfront was busy with workers hauling crates, forklifts groaning under heavy loads and fishermen cleaning their nets. But when asked about the missing detective, most grew quiet. Some shook their heads, claiming they saw nothing unusual. Others whispered that they had seen him walking near the warehouses, but only for a moment. Inside a dockside bar, investigators questioned patrons. The bartender remembered him, said he came in asking about suspicious shipments. But after that, nothing. No one saw him leave. No one saw a fight. It was as if he had simply stepped out into the rain and vanished into thin air. Still, whispers spread. Some workers hinted at shady figures who watched the docks late at night. A few mentioned mob ties, though no one dared speak too loud. The name of one dock boss came up more than once, but everyone swore they didn't know him well enough to say more. The detectives wrote it all down, but the answers were thin. The waterfront was full of shadows, but none of them showed the truth. The search teams pushed deeper into the waterfront. They split into groups, flashlights sweeping through giant warehouses that smelled of salt and rust. Metal doors creaked open, revealing stacked crates, old forklifts, and puddles of rainwater. Every corner was checked. Every locked door was forced open, but there was no sign of the detective. They searched basements too, damp, dark spaces with dripping pipes and broken windows. The echo of footsteps followed them as they moved room to room. But again, nothing. No dropped badge. No torn fabric. Not a single trace. Outside, others combed through narrow alleys between the warehouses. Trash bins overflowed. Rats scurried across wet pavement, and neon signs buzzed from nearby bars. It was the kind of place where bad deals happened in the shadows. But the alleys were silent, holding no clue about where the detective had gone. At one point, officers found fresh boot prints in the mud near the pier. They froze, thinking maybe these belonged to him. But after closer inspection, they realized the prints were from a dock worker's boots. Common, ordinary, meaningless. Hours stretched into days. Teams returned again and again, retracing their steps, hoping they had missed something small. But the warehouses gave them only silence. The alleys gave them only shadows. And the detective remained missing. If the warehouses held no answers, maybe the people did. Detectives returned to the workers, fishermen, and bar patrons, pressing harder this time. But what they got was confusion and fear. One dock worker swore he saw the detective talking to a tall man in a gray coat near the loading cranes. He said the two men looked serious, maybe even angry. But when asked for details like the man's face, his car, or which direction they walked, the worker hesitated. His story kept changing. Another fisherman claimed he saw nothing at all. Yet minutes later, he admitted he had glimpsed someone in a dark hat near the waterfront office. Was it the detective? He wasn't sure. A bartender insisted the detective was alone that night, asking questions, drinking only water. But a bar patron interrupted, saying no, he saw the detective step outside with someone else. When pressed, he couldn't describe the person. The contradictions piled up. Some witnesses remembered clear details. Others claimed complete ignorance. A few seemed nervous, as if saying too much might get them in trouble. By the end, detectives were left with fragments, stories that didn't match, timelines that didn't fit, and a growing suspicion that people knew more than they were willing to say. The truth was buried under shaky voices and half-seen memories. As weeks passed with no answers, rumors began to swirl. The most common theory pointed straight to organized crime. The docks had long been tied to smuggling, drugs, weapons, stolen goods. Everyone in law enforcement knew it, but few talked about it openly. Now, whispers spread that the detective had gotten too close to the wrong people. Some said he had been digging into shipments moving quietly through the waterfront. Others claimed he had started asking questions about which dock bosses were paying off cops to look the other way. Reporters latched onto the theory. Headlines screamed about mob ties at the waterfront. Talk shows speculated about drug cartels, shady middlemen, and backroom deals. None of it was proven, but the idea made sense to many. If anyone had the power to make a detective vanish without a trace, it was organized crime. Inside the precinct, some officers believed it too. They muttered that their colleague had poked into something too dangerous, but no one could prove it. There were no witnesses brave enough to step forward. No evidence tied to a single name, just rumors, heavy, dark, and growing louder every day. While theories painted him as reckless or even as someone who might have run away, his family refused to believe it. His wife spoke again to reporters, her voice sharp despite her grief. "He would never abandon us. Never. He loved his children. He loved his work. If he's not here, it's because someone took him." Her words carried weight. She reminded the public who he was, not a shadowy figure caught in corruption, but a father who read bedtime stories and a husband who worked long nights to keep the city safe. His children, older now, also spoke in interviews. The daughter, holding back tears, said she believed her father had been murdered because he was too honest. The son said he wanted to grow up to be a cop, to finish what Dad started. The family's defiance touched the city. People mailed letters of support. Strangers sent flowers. And though police investigators grew tired and frustrated, the family's refusal to give up kept the case alive in the public eye. They did not accept the idea of him walking away. To them, it was simple. Someone out there had stolen him, and they would not rest until the truth came out. The weeks turned into months, and with them came a flood of tips. Every phone call, every letter, every shaky voice claimed to know where the missing detective was. One caller swore he had seen the detective in Vancouver, Canada, working odd jobs under a fake name. Detectives sent men north, chasing the lead, but it ended with a stranger who only looked vaguely similar. Another tip said he had been spotted in California, hiding out near San Diego. Investigators drove hours, only to find nothing but another false sighting. There were dozens more. Someone claimed he was living in the woods like a hermit. Another insisted he had joined a criminal crew, using his police skills to help them. Some even claimed he was dead and buried under an abandoned house, but digs turned up nothing. Each time detectives put in the work. Each time the trail led nowhere. The wasted hours piled up. Detectives felt like they were chasing ghosts, blurry shadows that disappeared as soon as they thought they were close. And with every false lead, the real trail grew colder. By late 1986, the mood inside the precinct had shifted. What began as an all-hands search had become a grind of disappointment. Every promising lead had collapsed. Every long night had ended with nothing new to show. The department's resources were stretched thin. Other crimes demanded attention: robberies, assaults, new drug busts. Slowly, officers were pulled off the missing detective's case. Files were boxed up and pushed to the shelves. Frustration burned among the few detectives who still cared. They whispered that something didn't add up, that too many questions had been ignored. But officially, the case was inactive. The chief's public statements grew shorter. The media stopped asking daily questions. Headlines shifted to other stories. The reality was brutal. The department had given up. For the family, time did not dull the pain. While Seattle moved on, their house stayed frozen in grief. Every night felt like the night he didn't come home. The wife kept his badge on the nightstand. The children grew older, always carrying the weight of unanswered questions. They knew the city had stopped looking, but they hadn't. By the early 1990s, the missing detective story had turned into something bigger than a case file. It had become a legend. Everyone in Seattle knew about it. People swapped theories in bars, at bus stops, even at school playgrounds. Kids whispered that he was still out there, living under a fake name. Adults argued about whether he had been murdered or had run away. Police officers who joined the force after 1985 still heard the story on their first week. Some older detectives warned them about the case, calling it the ghost of the docks. It was a reminder that even one of their own could disappear without warning. His picture, once on newspapers, had turned into a symbol. Posters of his face still hung in a few precincts, yellowed and curling at the edges. For the public, he was no longer just a man. He was an unsolved mystery, a reminder of how fragile safety really was. People told and retold the story until it almost didn't feel real anymore. But for his family, it never stopped being real. Every rumor, every theory was like a wound reopened. For them, he wasn't a ghost story. He was still missing. Of all the theories, the cruelest one was this. Some people said the detective had run away. They whispered that he left on purpose. Maybe he had secret debts. Maybe he was hiding from criminals he couldn't handle. Maybe he had another family somewhere else. The rumor spread quickly. Neighbors repeated it. Talk radio hosts joked about it. Even a few young cops, too far removed from the case, wondered aloud if it could be true. For the family, it was unbearable. His wife fought back every time. She told anyone who asked that he was loyal, dedicated, and loved his children too much to ever walk away. The kids, now old enough to understand, spoke up too. They said their father wasn't the kind of man who gave up. Still, the whispers never fully stopped. People liked simple answers, and running away was simpler than believing someone had erased a detective from existence. But deep down, those who had truly known him never bought into it. They knew he was the kind of man who ran toward danger, not away from it. And so, the runaway theory hurt the family, but never convinced them. Another theory refused to die, that the detective had been silenced by criminals. Seattle's docks were no stranger to shady business in the 1980s. Drugs flowed in on ships. Money changed hands in back rooms. People who asked too many questions sometimes went missing. This idea made sense to many. The detective had been working cases tied to organized crime. He had been asking about drug shipments at the docks. If anyone had a reason to shut him up, it was the mob. Rumors spread about a secret meeting the night he disappeared. Some said he was lured to the waterfront by fake informants. Others claimed he caught people in the middle of a deal and paid the price. Theories grew darker with every retelling, his body hidden in a warehouse, dumped in the bay, or buried under concrete at a construction site. The police never confirmed any of this, but even some officers admitted it felt possible. Criminals had money, power, and the will to make problems disappear. And if the detective had gotten too close to their business, maybe that was enough to make sure he never came home. As the years dragged on, darker theories began to spread. Some whispered that the detective's real enemies weren't gangsters at the docks, but men wearing the same badge. According to rumors, he had been digging into things he wasn't supposed to. Not just mob deals, but corruption inside his own department. Some said he was close to uncovering secrets that would have destroyed careers. The whispers painted a chilling picture. Maybe someone inside the station saw him as a threat. Maybe they wanted him silenced before he exposed too much. At roll calls in bars, officers lowered their voices. The idea of a brother in blue turning on one of their own was unthinkable. But the absence of evidence, the total disappearance, made people wonder if the cover-up theory explained too much. Detectives who worked with him denied it, saying he was respected and liked. But skeptics pointed to odd details. Missing reports, search areas overlooked, phone records that vanished from the case file. The public began to see two possible villains: organized crime from outside or betrayal from within. Neither answer gave the family peace. Both left them with the same painful truth: he was gone, and no one could explain why. In the late 90s and early 2000s, several retired officers finally began to talk. Off-duty, away from the badge, they admitted the case had always felt strange. One remembered reports disappearing from the file room. Another recalled late-night phone calls warning detectives to drop it. A third admitted he was told directly by a superior, "Don't go too deep, let it die." These weren't official statements, and none of them could be proved, but they added fuel to the belief that something bigger was hiding beneath the surface. Some retired cops claimed the department had been pressured by outsiders, maybe politicians, maybe powerful businessmen connected to the docks. Others insisted the threats came from within, that fellow officers wanted the trail cold. For the family, hearing these confessions years later only made the pain worse. If even a fraction of it was true, it meant justice was stolen from them. Still, nothing concrete surfaced. The whispers stayed whispers and the official line remained: "We don't know what happened." While the rumors swirled, the family lived in a different reality. His wife raised their children alone. Every birthday, every holiday, was a reminder of the empty chair at the table. She rejected every theory that painted him as a runaway. She said he loved his kids too much to ever leave them. Instead, she clung to the belief that he had been murdered, taken by criminals, or silenced by someone powerful. The emotional toll was heavy. His children grew up under the shadow of his disappearance. They had to face school friends asking, "Did your dad leave?" They had to watch TV specials label him a mystery instead of a man. For the wife, time didn't heal. It only deepened the wound. Each year without answers was another year stolen. She once told a reporter, "If he was killed, tell me. If he left, prove it. But don't leave us in this silence." Decades later, she was still stuck in the same place, waiting, hopping, refusing to accept that the world had simply moved on. By the early 1990s, the detective's name was fading from public memory. At the start, his disappearance had been the biggest story in Seattle. Newspapers, TV anchors, even late-night talk shows had covered it. But 10 years later, the world had moved on. Inside the police department, the case file sat on a shelf, gathering dust. New murders, robberies, and drug wars filled the desks of investigators. The resources once poured into finding him were gone. Detectives who had once sworn they wouldn't rest had been reassigned, retired, or simply burned out. Every now and then, a new officer would stumble onto the case file and bring up the mystery, but the answer was always the same: no new leads, no new evidence. For the family, it was worse. To the outside world, the missing detective was now just a story from the past. But to them, every day was still the day he vanished. His wife kept his belongings boxed neatly, refusing to move on. His children, now older, felt the weight of his absence in ways the public couldn't see. The early 90s carried a cold truth. The case was dead, at least officially, and it seemed like it would stay that way forever. Then, almost by accident, something surfaced. It didn't come from a major investigation or a breakthrough tip. It was small, almost forgettable at first, but it carried just enough weight to make people pause. An old report was re-examined. A piece of evidence, overlooked years earlier, suddenly seemed important. A name, a location, or maybe a detail about that night at the docks, something no one had noticed before. The discovery wasn't a solution, but it cracked open a door that had been locked for more than a decade. For the first time since the detective vanished, hope flickered. The case wasn't dead. Not yet. It was spring of 1995, just outside Seattle. A construction crew was working on a new project. Nothing unusual, just digging trenches for a foundation. The day was gray, the kind of sky workers were used to in Washington. The crew had been at it since early morning, shovels and machines cutting into the ground. Everything felt routine. The men joked, the foreman shouted instructions, and dirt piled high beside the trenches. It was just another shift. Then one worker's shovel struck something hard. At first he thought it was just rock. He hit again, and the sound was different, sharp, metallic. He knelt down, brushing dirt away with his gloves. A small piece of twisted metal poked through the soil. It looked like scrap, maybe part of an old machine buried years ago. The worker waved over a friend, curious but not alarmed. They had found junk like this before: cans, broken tools, even old car parts. Still, this one seemed heavier. They dug around it, clearing more dirt. The object was crushed, mangled, but intact enough to see shape. It wasn't a random piece of garbage. It looked like something once important, now destroyed and forgotten beneath the earth. The workers dragged the object out of the trench and laid it on the dirt. It was small enough to hold, but heavy. At first glance, it looked like a broken radio or some kind of old electrical box. Its casing was bent inward, wires exposed, knobs smashed flat. Most of the crew dismissed it. "Just trash," one man said. Seattle had plenty of old junk buried around construction sites. The foreman was ready to toss it aside so work could continue. But one worker, a younger guy named Mark, stared at it longer. Something about the shape caught his eye. He rubbed away the caked mud with his sleeve. Beneath the scratches, faint numbers appeared, not random, but stamped into the metal. They weren't the kind of marks left by accident. These looked official. The others leaned in, curious now. Mark tilted it in the light, wiping more dirt. The numbers looked like part of a serial code. He didn't know what it meant, but it suggested this wasn't just junk. It was once issued, once tracked. The crew went quiet. Construction noise carried on around them, but their trench became still. For the first time that day, they realized they might be holding a clue to something much bigger than scrap metal. Mark kept cleaning the metal. Then he froze. His fingers had uncovered faint letters stamped into the casing. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Look at this," he whispered. The letters spelled out something chilling. Seattle Police Department. The group of workers fell silent. The crushed object wasn't just any radio, it was a police radio. The kind detectives and officers had carried in the 1980s. Questions flew instantly. Why was it here, buried deep in dirt outside the city? Who had left it? And how long had it been hidden? The foreman's face hardened. This wasn't something they could ignore. "Call it in," he said. A supervisor pulled out a phone and contacted authorities. Within an hour, squad cars arrived. Officers roped off the site, treating it like a crime scene. Workers stood back, whispering nervously. The police lifted the crushed radio carefully, turning it over. Despite the damage, the engraving was clear. A number tag still clung to the back. Serial numbers were logged, and it didn't take long before a match was found. The object belonged to the detective who had vanished 10 years earlier. Seattle's most mysterious cold case had just been ripped open again. At the police lab, technicians placed the crushed radio under bright lights. It was in bad shape, twisted nearly flat, but parts of it still carried engraved numbers. Every police radio had a unique serial code, logged when it was issued. The technicians carefully cleaned the surface, brushing away dirt and rust. Then, slowly, the numbers came into view. They typed them into the department's old records. The room went silent as the computer pulled up the result. The radio wasn't just any piece of lost equipment. It was issued in 1984. The owner's name flashed on the screen: Detective James Whitman, the missing detective, the one who had vanished without a trace a decade earlier. Word spread fast through the department. Officers gathered in hallways, whispering. Some were shocked, others pale. It wasn't just a random clue, it was hard evidence tied directly to the coldest case in Seattle. If his radio was buried here, what did that mean? Did someone destroy it to cover up what happened? Was the detective killed and the radio dumped to erase his last call for help? The serial number left no doubt. After 10 years of silence, the case had just come alive again. It didn't take long for the press to find out. By evening, the story was everywhere. Television anchors leaned forward, voices tense. "Breaking news tonight. Construction workers have uncovered what police confirmed to be the missing detective's radio, buried outside Seattle." Headlines blared across newspapers the next morning. "Detective, radio found after 10 years. Cold case back in spotlight." People across the city couldn't believe it. For years, the case had been a quiet legend, whispered about but rarely mentioned in the news. Now it was back, front page, impossible to ignore. Reporters camped outside the police department. Cameras flashed at every officer walking in or out. The detective's name, long buried in archives, was suddenly on every channel again. And the family, they were thrown back into the nightmare. His wife, older now, stepped carefully into the spotlight. Her voice shook as she told reporters, "This proves he didn't run away. Something happened to him. Someone knows what." The discovery reignited everything. Questions burned hotter than ever. Where was the detective? Who had buried his radio? And why had it taken 10 years to surface? Seattle was hooked all over again. The Seattle Police Department had no choice. The cold file that had sat untouched for years was pulled back onto desks. Detectives were assigned, evidence boxes reopened, and old notes spread across tables. The atmosphere was tense. Many of the original investigators were now retired. Others still in the department looked uneasy, as if this wasn't a case they wanted to see resurface. But the media attention left no room for hesitation. The police chief held a press conference declaring the case officially reopened. "We owe it to his family and to the city to find the truth," he said. Cameras flashed. Questions shouted, but the answers were thin. Behind the scenes, detectives scrambled. They re-interviewed old witnesses, retraced the detective's last known steps, and searched for anyone who might explain how his radio ended up crushed and buried. Meanwhile, the family was pulled back into the storm. His children, now teenagers, faced reporters who wanted to know how they felt. His wife repeated the same line: "He didn't leave us. He was taken from us." Pressure built on the department. 10 years had passed with no answers. Now the city wanted resolution and fast. The case was alive again, but the clock was ticking. The radio should have been a breakthrough, but instead it left investigators spinning. Yes, it tied directly to the missing detective, but it also raised a storm of new questions. First, the location. The radio was found miles from the waterfront, buried in dirt outside the city. Why there? If the detective had vanished at the docks, how did his equipment end up far inland? Second, the condition. The device wasn't just broken, it had been deliberately crushed, as if someone wanted it destroyed. But if that was true, why not throw it in the river? Why not burn it? Why bury it? Detectives pored over maps, searching for connections to the site. Nothing obvious appeared. No ties to the detective, no record of police searches in that area. Just empty ground where a machine was now digging. Some officers suggested maybe it was tossed out a car window and later buried by construction. Others thought it might have been moved years after the disappearance. But none of it made sense. Instead of solving the mystery, the radio had deepened it. 10 years later, the case was alive again, but the answers were still out of reach. Inside the department, whispers grew darker. Detectives traded theories in hushed voices, careful not to be overheard. One idea chilled them most. What if the radio wasn't just evidence? What if it was a warning? The fact it had been crushed and buried seemed deliberate, almost like someone was leaving a message. The detective had tried to speak, but his voice had been silenced. His radio, the very tool he used to call for backup, had been destroyed. Another theory crept in. Maybe the radio wasn't buried randomly. Maybe someone had placed it there to keep the case buried too. A cover-up. A reminder that those who asked too many questions would be silenced just the same. Reporters caught wind of these rumors. Stories began suggesting something darker was at play, hinting that people inside law enforcement might not have wanted the truth exposed. For the family, the discovery was painful. His wife said through tears, "They smashed his voice, but they can't erase him." The crushed radio was no longer just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of silence, betrayal, and unfinished business. The case had shifted, and now the shadows inside the department itself were starting to look suspicious. Detectives reopened the case with fresh eyes. The first step was simple: pull every file from storage. Inside the cold case room, rows of cabinets lined the walls. Boxes stacked on top of each other held decades of old reports. They found the detective's file shoved into the back. It was thick, but when they opened it, things didn't add up. Pages were missing. Entire sections were cut short. Reports ended mid-sentence as if someone had stopped writing halfway through. Even stranger, timelines didn't match. One document listed him leaving the station at 3:00 p.m., another claimed 3:30. A witness statement was dated a full day after the detective vanished, but it described events that same night. Detectives highlighted inconsistencies. Why were key details missing? Why were copies of some reports filed but the originals gone? In one folder, they found a request for surveillance footage from the docks, but no footage attached, no explanation given. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. The file had been tampered with. This wasn't just sloppy work. Someone, at some point, had either removed or rewritten information. And now, 10 years later, the missing pieces told their own story. Someone hadn't wanted the truth on record. The next discovery came when detectives reviewed the timeline of the original search. On paper, it looked like police had jumped into action the night he vanished. But digging deeper, they realized the truth was very different. The missing detective's car was found near the docks in the early evening. By normal protocol, that should have triggered a citywide alert. But the actual search didn't begin until hours later. Why? The file gave no reason. Even worse, interviews with dock workers weren't conducted until 3 days after the disappearance. By then, memories were fuzzy. People moved on. Potential evidence could have been washed away or cleaned up. A request for canine units was dated nearly a week late. Maps of search zones showed massive gaps, as if whole sections of the waterfront had been skipped. One detective slammed the folder shut. "This makes no sense," he said. "Either they were incompetent or they didn't want to find him." The new team circled these gaps in red ink. They weren't looking at mistakes anymore. They were looking at choices. Delays this big didn't happen by accident. Someone had slowed the search on purpose. But why, and who had the power to do it? The most chilling discovery came when they reviewed his last cases. At first, nothing stood out. Burglary, assault, a stolen car. But then one thin folder caught their eye. It wasn't thick like the others. Just a few notes and half a report. But the subject line read, "Dockside activity/possible corruption." Inside were scribbles about officers being seen near drug shipments, names of suspected smugglers, and vague mentions of money being moved. The new detectives leaned in. This was it. The missing detective hadn't just been working normal cases. He had been investigating his own department. The more they read, the worse it looked. Several names listed in the notes belonged to officers still working in Seattle. Others had retired, living quietly away from the city. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to paint a terrifying picture. If he had stumbled onto corruption inside the force, then his disappearance wasn't random. It was connected. The detective's last assignment might have cost him his life. And now, 10 years later, the same questions loomed. How deep did the corruption go? And who inside the department wanted him gone? The deeper the new team digs, the darker it gets. In the old files, they start noticing names that keep repeating. Not suspects, not civilians, but officers. Men who had once worn the same badge as the missing detective. Rumors swirl in those records. Notes in the margins, whispered tips, anonymous calls. They all hint at the same thing. Some cops might have been tied to organized crime. It sounds impossible, unthinkable, but the more they read, the more it looks real. The missing detective had been working the docks. The same docks where drugs were coming in. The same docks where millions in dirty money passed through quietly. And every time he got closer, something strange happened. A lead would vanish. A witness would back out. A file would go missing. Now it begins to make sense. If the detective had uncovered proof that certain officers were taking money, protecting shipments, or even working hand in hand with crime families, he would have been in serious danger. The radio buried in the ground, far away from the water, feels less like an accident and more like a warning, almost like someone planted it on purpose to say, "We're in control here." For the first time, investigators consider something terrifying. The detective may not have been taken by strangers. He may not have been just unlucky. He might have been silenced by people wearing the same uniform he trusted. That theory changes everything. The new investigators know they need answers, so they begin tracking down the men who worked the case back in the late 70s and early 80s. Many are retired now. Some live quiet lives far from the city. The first few interviews feel routine, but soon the tone shifts. A few of the old cops act strangely nervous. They answer questions with questions. They suddenly can't remember key details, even though these were once big cases. Others show a different side. After years of holding it in, a couple of retired officers finally admit small, strange things about that summer. They remember late-night meetings at the docks, where higher-ups told them to stand down. They recall orders to wait when they wanted to search certain warehouses. They remember how quickly the case was shut down, how little follow-up there was, and how nobody seemed to push back. None of them say the words outright, but the hints are enough. The missing detective was on to something real, and the silence that followed his disappearance wasn't random. It's as if the department back then wanted this case to die. The interviews keep going, and soon they take a darker turn. A few ex-officers give off a clear warning: drop it, leave it alone. Their tone isn't casual, it feels more like a threat. But one former cop cracks under pressure. Sitting in his small kitchen, his hands shaking, he admits he's carried guilt for years. He says he knows more than he can safely say. He doesn't give details, but he hints that the detective's last days were tangled in something far bigger than anyone ever admitted. He stops short, his eyes filling with fear. He warns the investigators that digging deeper could put them in danger too. "They don't forget," he mutters, "even now." The team leaves the interview unsettled. They have more questions than answers. The case that once looked like a tragic disappearance now feels like a deliberate cover-up. The whispers about dirty cops, the missing files, the strange delays, the nervous old men. Piece by piece, the picture is changing. It's no longer just about finding out what happened to one detective. It's about exposing something the department had buried for decades. And if the former cop was right, the people responsible might still be out there, watching. By now, the case is alive again, but the energy inside the department has shifted. Current officers start whispering to each other in hallways. It's not excitement, it's fear. Some of them know the history. They remember how strange things got when the detective vanished years ago. They've heard the old rumors, the ones about dirty cops and secret deals. And they know that if those rumors are true, digging too deep could make enemies in powerful places. One officer compares it to walking through a minefield. Step wrong, he says quietly, and it blows up in your face. Detectives leading the case begin to notice it too. Requests for records suddenly take longer than expected. Meetings with senior staff feel tense, like people are watching what's being said and what isn't. Files they ask for come back missing pages, or redacted so heavily that whole stories are lost. It feels like invisible walls are closing in around the investigation. The deeper they push, the stronger the resistance becomes. Some of the younger officers ask bluntly, "What if the department doesn't really want this solved?" That thought spreads like smoke. It hangs in the air, unspoken but heavy. Everyone senses it. The missing detective story isn't just a cold case anymore. It's a dangerous one. After weeks of interviews, missing files, and dead ends, the trail begins to point in a chilling direction. At first, the theory was that the detective was taken by criminals on the docks. Maybe drug dealers, maybe smugglers, maybe someone scared of exposure. But the clues don't fit cleanly. His radio wasn't left near the water. Witnesses weren't silenced by gangs. And the pressure inside the department feels too deliberate, too heavy. Finally, one investigator says what everyone else is thinking but afraid to say out loud. What if he wasn't killed by criminals at all? The room goes silent. The detective's last assignment was digging into police corruption. He was tracking names that linked directly to the docks, to money, to power. If he uncovered too much, if he got too close, the people most threatened wouldn't have been strangers. They would have been people he worked beside, people who wore the same uniform. The idea is almost too dark to believe, but it explains everything. The missing files, the strange delays, the nervous retired cops, the warnings to drop it. It explains why, for decades, no one inside the department wanted the case reopened. The shocking possibility takes hold. The detective may not have been a victim of criminals. He may have been betrayed by his own. And if that's true, the cover-up runs deeper than anyone ever imagined. Detectives begin pulling threads together, and soon, a disturbing pattern appears. They go back through the old files, checking every log and every report. That's when they notice the gaps. Patrol logs are missing entire shifts. Key reports are cut off halfway as if someone stopped writing mid-sentence. In some cases, files are missing completely. At first, this could look like sloppy record keeping, but the more they look, the clearer it becomes. These were not accidents. One file mentions a witness who claimed to see the missing detective near the docks after hours. But when detectives search for that statement, it's gone. Only a note remains saying handled. Handled by who? No one knows. Another report lists names of officers assigned to a late-night dockside patrol. But that section of the report has been blacked out with thick ink. And then there are the delays. Requests for backup logged hours after calls were made. Search parties that didn't start until days later. These aren't small mistakes, they look intentional. The investigators begin mapping everything out. Missing logs, erased files, strange delays, odd witness statements. And the pattern points to one chilling conclusion. Someone inside the department had been burying the truth. The case isn't just about a missing detective anymore. It's about a cover-up. Investigators start going back to old colleagues, retired officers who were around during that summer. Most of them refuse to talk, giving vague answers or saying they don't remember. But then, one man finally cracks. He's older now, his hands shaking as he holds his coffee. At first, he insists he doesn't know anything, But when detectives press, his voice begins to break. "I shouldn't be saying this," he whispers. "It's not safe." They assure him he's protected, but he shakes his head. His eyes are filled with fear. Still, he keeps going. He tells them the missing detective had been asking too many questions. Not about street crimes, not about random thugs, but about people inside the department. He had collected notes, kept files, and was closing in on something big. The retired officer leans closer. He was getting close to proving it. That's why he vanished. Detectives ask, "Proving what?" The old cop looks down at his hands. He doesn't say it directly, but he doesn't have to. His silence, his tears, and his fear tell them everything. The missing detective had uncovered something so dangerous. The department itself wanted it buried. The pieces finally come together, and the revelation hits like a thunderclap. The missing detective had discovered that certain officers weren't just ignoring crime. They were part of it. They were protecting drug shipments moving through the docks. Shipments would come in late at night, hidden in cargo containers. Instead of cracking down, these officers made sure no one interfered. Patrol schedules were adjusted, reports were erased, and in return, those officers pocketed cash. It wasn't a small operation. It was organized, controlled, and dangerous. Anyone who asked too many questions became a problem, and the detective, by digging into the docks and corruption, had become the biggest problem of all. Detectives realized that explains everything: the missing files, the strange delays, the silence from retired officers. It also explains the fear still hanging inside the department years later. The truth was simple and horrifying. The detective had uncovered a pipeline of drugs and money, protected not by criminals on the street, but by the very people sworn to stop them. And when he got too close, those same people may have made sure he disappeared forever. Detectives pieced together what likely happened that night. The missing officer hadn't gone to the docks on a whim. He was called there. Someone had told him there was a meeting, maybe a source with new information, maybe a supposed break in the corruption case he was chasing. Whatever it was, he believed it enough to go alone. Records show he left the station calm, not worried. His car was parked at the waterfront, keys left inside. That detail now makes sense. He thought he was only stepping away for a quick talk. But instead of a source waiting in the shadows, there were men who wanted him silenced. The ambush was fast. Witnesses years later recalled seeing shapes near the warehouses. A couple of dock workers heard muffled voices and a struggle but didn't think much of it at the time. No shots were reported. No alarms were raised. Whatever happened, it was quiet and controlled. By the time anyone thought to look for him, it was already too late. Detectives now believe the officer was tricked, lured into the perfect trap. And that night in the rain at the docks, he never stood a chance. For years, the crushed radio looked like a mystery. Why would it end up buried in a construction site far from the waterfront? Now, with everything uncovered, investigators see it differently. That radio wasn't lost by chance. It was destroyed on purpose. After the ambush, his killers likely smashed it. If the radio had stayed intact, it might have recorded calls or been traced back to the scene. By destroying it, they erased a link to what happened. But smashing wasn't enough. They also buried it, far from the docks, far from the timeline of his last known steps. It was meant to vanish forever. Detectives now see it as more than a clue. It's a message. Someone wanted it gone so badly, they went to extreme lengths to hide it. And yet, fate brought it back years later, forcing the truth to surface. The crushed radio isn't random trash. It's the silent witness to a cover-up. And it proves that what happened that night wasn't an accident, wasn't confusion. It was murder. With the truth finally leaking out, people who had stayed quiet for years start to talk. Dock workers who were young at the time come forward as older men. They recall patrol cars near the docks late that night, cars that had no reason to be there. They remember being told to forget what they saw. An ex-cop finally admits he heard rumors the morning after, whispers inside the station that the detective wasn't coming back. At the time, he thought it was just talk. Now he believes it was a warning to stay quiet. Another worker swears he saw a group moving something heavy into a truck behind the warehouses. He didn't realize the importance until decades later, when the case resurfaced. Piece by piece, the wall of silence breaks. Each new account matches parts of the theory investigators have built, and though none of the witnesses saw the entire crime, together they draw the same picture. The detective didn't run away. He didn't vanish by choice. He was lured, ambushed, and erased by people who should have protected him. And for the first time, Seattle begins to see the dark truth hiding in plain sight. The investigation leaves little room for doubt. The detective wasn't killed by random criminals on the street. He wasn't swallowed by the chaos of the city. He was betrayed. By the end, every lead points inward, back to the badge, back to the men who once called him a brother. Detectives trace the cover-up, the erased files, the delayed searches, the witnesses told to stay quiet. None of it makes sense unless someone inside the department was pulling the strings. The hardest truth to face is this: he trusted his fellow officers with his life. He worked alongside them every day. He laughed with them, shared coffee, backed them up on dangerous calls. And yet those same men saw him as a threat. He had gotten too close to their secrets, too close to the money flowing through the docks. So they chose betrayal, they chose silence, and they chose to erase one of their own. For the family, the truth is almost too heavy to bear. The man who had dedicated his life to justice had been destroyed by the very system he believed in. Even with everything uncovered, one piece is still missing: the detective himself. Teams search old records, comb through possible burial sites, and recheck reports from the night he vanished. But his body is never found. Investigators believe his killers worked quickly that night. After the ambush, they moved him away from the docks. Some think he was taken out of the city. Others believe he lies hidden somewhere near the waterfront, sealed in a place nobody has dared to check. The crushed radio was proof of murder. The witness accounts confirmed betrayal, but without remains there is no grave, no closure. For his wife and children, this is the cruelest part. They know what happened, but they cannot lay him to rest. Every birthday, every holiday, every empty chair is a reminder that the last piece of the puzzle is still missing. The city sees the case as solved. The department points to the cover-up as the explanation, but the family doesn't see it that way. For them, it will never be finished until he is found. And to this day, his body has never been recovered. When the truth finally comes out, Seattle is stunned. For years, people whispered theories about what happened to the missing detective. Some thought criminals had silenced him. Others believed he ran away. But the real answer is far worse than anyone imagined. The news spreads quickly. Members of the police department had betrayed one of their own. Headlines scream betrayal. TV anchors repeat the shocking words again and again. Officers, men sworn to protect the city, had turned against a fellow detective. On the streets, people talk about little else. How can you trust the badge if the badge itself is corrupt? Families who once felt safe now look at police differently. If a detective wasn't safe from his own, what chance did an ordinary citizen have? For the department, it is the darkest moment in their history. Younger officers feel ashamed. Veterans, some who worked with the missing detective, feel crushed. And for Seattle, the betrayal cuts deep. This was not just a crime. It was a wound to the entire city's trust. And even with answers, people wonder, how many others stayed silent to protect themselves? The city will never look at its police the same way again. Soon after the truth is revealed, arrests begin. Several retired officers, men who once wore the same badge as the missing detective, are charged. Their faces appear on the evening news, older now but carrying the weight of their crimes. The charges are serious: obstruction, conspiracy, and even murder. For years, these men had lived free, some even collecting pensions. Now they are marched into courtrooms, accused of destroying the life of the very man who trusted them. The city watches closely. For many, it feels like justice, but justice that has arrived far too late. 10 years have passed. Evidence has faded. Witnesses are older. The accused men know how to hide behind technicalities. Still, the indictments send a clear message: the truth cannot stay buried forever. Inside the department, the trials split opinion. Some officers believe the guilty deserve everything they get. Others argue it was too long ago, that reopening old wounds only makes things worse. But for the family of the missing detective, These arrests are proof. Proof that he didn't vanish on his own. Proof that people are finally being held responsible. It's not the ending they wanted, but it's something. For 10 years, the detective's family lived in uncertainty. Every day was filled with questions. Did he leave? Was he alive somewhere? Or was he gone forever? The crushed radio had given them hope, but also new pain. Now, with the truth revealed, they finally have answers. They learn he was ambushed, betrayed, and silenced by men he once called brothers. It's a truth that hurts deeply, but at least it is the truth. His wife speaks publicly. She tells reporters that for years she held onto the belief he was murdered, and now that belief is confirmed. Her voice cracks as she says, "They took him from us, but they could not take away who he was." His children, now older, share their own stories. They talk about growing up without a father, about the pain of not knowing, and about the small relief of finally understanding what happened. For them, the answers do not erase the loss. Nothing ever could. But knowing means they can stop searching, stop wondering, and begin to grieve properly. It's closure, but a painful one. When the truth finally breaks, his children are no longer little kids. They are teenagers, even young adults, shaped by a decade of silence. Reporters ask them what it was like growing up without answers. Their responses are raw and heartbreaking. One of his sons explains how, every night, he used to wait by the window, hoping his father might walk up the driveway. His daughter admits she hated going to school events because she was the only one without a dad in the audience. For years, they carried that pain in silence. Now, with answers, the silence is broken. The children talk about how the truth changes everything. It doesn't erase the years of pain, but it makes sense of them. They no longer have to wonder if their father abandoned them, or if he simply disappeared without reason. They know he was fighting for what was right and paid the price for it. Their words hit the city hard. Seattle hears the pain, but also the strength in their voices. The children of a betrayed detective refuse to let his story be forgotten. Through all of this, one object becomes the symbol of the case: the crushed police radio. To outsiders, it's just a piece of broken metal, but to the detective's family, it is everything. His wife calls it the last message he ever sent. His children say it feels like he was trying to leave proof behind, some way of saying, "Don't stop looking." Reporters film the radio up close. Its scratches, dents, and faded engraving are shown on every news station. People across the city recognize it instantly. The object that once was evidence of a cover-up has now become a symbol of truth. The family decides to keep it. They refuse to let it sit in a storage box or evidence locker. For them, it's personal. It's the one piece of him they still have. In the end, the radio isn't just broken equipment. It is a reminder that even in silence, the truth can find its way back to the surface. Seattle does something it hasn't done in years. It comes together to honor the detective. The department holds a memorial ceremony. Officers, both young and old, gather in uniform. Bagpipes play, flags are lowered, and his name is spoken with respect. For many officers, it's a moment of shame mixed with pride, shame that their own betrayed him, but pride in the man who refused to turn away from corruption. The city follows with its own tributes. Streets are lined with candles. Neighbors who never even met the detective place flowers near the docks where he vanished. His story touches people across generations, from those who lived through the 1980s to younger Seattle residents who only knew the case as a legend. In schools, his story is told as a warning about corruption, but also as an example of courage. The detective becomes more than just a victim. He becomes a symbol of standing for what is right, even when it costs everything. Seattle mourns, but it also honors. His name is no longer tied to mystery. It is tied to truth. The betrayal is something Seattle will never forget. It wasn't just one man who turned on the detective. It was a system that allowed corruption to grow unchecked. That part of the story is a warning. Future officers, city leaders, and ordinary citizens are reminded that silence can be as deadly as action. Looking the other way has consequences. But alongside betrayal, there is courage. The detective's name becomes tied to integrity. People repeat his story in classrooms, police academies, and even in city council meetings. He is remembered as a man who tried to pull back the curtain on wrongdoing and who refused to break, even when it cost him his life. Years later, reforms are quietly credited to him. Departments become more careful about internal accountability. Whistleblowers are taken more seriously. New recruits are warned of the dangers of unchecked loyalty. His case becomes part of training, a reminder that the badge represents truth, not silence. The betrayal stays in memory, but his courage shines brighter. The detective's legacy becomes twofold: a painful reminder of what happens when trust is destroyed, and a powerful example of what it means to stand alone for what is right. In the end, the detective's story is not just about one man. It's about the nature of secrets and the inevitability of truth. For years, the cover-up worked. His radio was buried, witnesses were silent, files were pushed into the dark corners of archives. It seemed as though the betrayal would never be uncovered. But time has a way of undoing lies. The truth began with small cracks, a memory shared, a rumor whispered, a broken piece of evidence resurfacing. Each piece was fragile on its own, but together they formed the undeniable picture of what happened. That's the lesson. Lies may last a season or even decades, but they cannot last forever. Sooner or later, the truth finds a way out, and when it does, it speaks louder than any cover-up. The detective may never return home. His family may never have a grave to visit, but they have the truth. And in the end, that is its own form of justice. Seattle moves on, but the story remains told in whispers, in classrooms, in ceremonies, in the hearts of those who remember. It is a story of betrayal. It is a story of courage. But most of all, it is a story of truth that refused to stay buried.